Now and for, if you're going to tell a lie, the message is, make it a big one.
It is easier to get the masses to believe in big lies than small ones.
Hitler censored this photograph.
What have you got there, Smith?
This photograph was between the pages of the Gazette.
What photograph?
Jones and Rutherford. They confessed to aiding the underground and being in Eurasia during Hate Week. But here it says...
What are you talking about, Smith? I don't see any photograph. No photograph of the traitors Jones and Rutherford exists, does it?
No.
The system is not perfect. Sometimes there are errors.
The great liars of the century have proved adept at using the century's technology, eliminating rivals in image and reality, especially men like Alexander Dubček, who challenged Big Brother's lies.
Do you solemnly swear that in the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please be seated.
You've admitted before this committee that you lied to representatives of the Iranians in order to try and release a hostage. Is that correct?
I lied every time I met the Iranians.
Can you assure this committee that you are not here now lying to protect your commander-in-chief?
I am not lying to protect anybody, Counsel.
So let's get to the facts. The charge has been made that the United States has shipped weapons to Iran as ransom payment for the release of American hostages in Lebanon, that the United States undercut its allies and secretly violated American policy against trafficking with terrorists. Those charges are utterly false.
I had no prior knowledge of the Watergate break-in. I neither took part in nor knew about any of the subsequent cover-up activities.
Leonid Brezhnev speaks. Long live the eternal, inviolable friendship between the Soviet Union and the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic. Long live world peace.
All the instruments of dictatorships have changed, of course, very, very greatly in terms of technology. There is now a possibility of diffusing lies through mass media of all sorts, which would make lies more or less impossible to stop.
Total output for 1959 reaches 13.35 million tons. Almost unbelievably, the second five-year plan goal of 12 million tons is exceeded in 2 years. A great industrial victory, it lays a solid foundation for continuing big leaps forward in the future.
We don't know if Mao really did swim the Yangtze, but big lies have usually had at their center a godlike political figure who justify in their name the sacrifice of truth.
Here I'm going to be a little bit metaphysical and say that, well, really say in the words of Chesterton, that when men cease to believe in God, they don't then believe in nothing, they believe in anything. And you can very well argue that 20th century man has been particularly susceptible to lies.
Well, I think they take different forms, isn't it? I mean, in some cases it takes the form of suppression and control of newspapers, as in the case of China, and I guess to some extent a similar story could be said in the case of the Ukraine famine in the Soviet Union. Other times, of course, you might be actually generate a level of hysteria and a kind of finger-pointing that makes it very difficult for people to make use of the vehicles of free speech that existed. I'm thinking, for example, of the McCarthy period in the United States.
Without a controlled press, red tyranny could not survive, so the town's newspaper editor, who is likely to be independent, is quickly seized to adorn a concentration camp. Prepared propaganda speedily rolls from the once free presses, and the picture on the front page tells one and all who gets allegiance from now on. Organized demonstrations in the city parks play a part in the final subjugation.
Big lies are big. There are many different ways of getting to the big lie. Whoever said that eternal vigilance is needed for preserving liberty, I'm afraid it's also needed for stopping big lies.
The camera can, and usually did, lie, as the technologies of truth were quickly kidnapped by the uniquely all-powerful 20th century nation-state. The Soviet Union was the first state to formally renounce truth in order to build a classless utopia. Truth was a bourgeois illusion. This new civilization only needed electrification and the truths of the Communist Party.
Well, the whole thing was one big lie to the extent that it was never admitted that anything was wrong with the system. It was never admitted that it wasn't working, that it was, above all, never admitted that Stalin was not right about everything, in everything he said, everything he did. But anybody could see that that was not so.
Stalin's first big lie grew out of his deliberate starvation of the peasants in the Ukraine. In 1932, Stalin demanded a grain delivery from there that led to mass hunger. Stalin's agents seized the last remnants of food stocks. Resistance was met by the burning of villages, terror, mass executions. One party activist later described the terror and the lies.
In the terrible year 1933, I saw women and children with distended bellies turning blue. I heard children choking on their own screams. It was excruciating to see this. But I told myself I mustn't give in to pity. For communism, everything was permissible, to lie and to destroy even millions of people.
Three million children born in 1932 died of starvation. Almost all these photographs appeared in American newspapers in 1933. Despite censorship, the West did get accurate reports on the starvation being inflicted on one of Europe's biggest nations. Western reporters defied Stalin's censors and thugs and went to find the truth. Prominent among them was Malcolm Muggeridge.
Well, there was a terrific lot of talk that there was a very severe famine there. But it was almost impossible to get any solid information about it. And so I thought I'd just go down there. And I just took a chance and got a railway ticket and went off to Kiev and Rostov and got off the train at different places.
As I began to be very critical of the whole setup, criticize the use of terrorism by the government, the articles that I wrote on the famine would undoubtedly, I would have had to leave, but I sent those over in a diplomatic bag. They would never have got out of the country otherwise, and I left before they had appeared.
But truth-tellers like Muggeridge had to contend with men like Edouard Herriot, twice Premier of France, who said the famine was a lie of the bourgeois press.
J'ai déjà visité Odessa et Kiev. J'ai été partout très intéressé par l'effort admirable d'organisation qui a été réalisé.
Президент Еліот сказав, я щасливий прибути сюди з послом Франції та моїми колегами по парламенту французькому та столиці України.
Many left-wing visitors like George Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells came to praise Stalin, not to bury him. H.G. Wells said, "Apart from individual atrocities, the Red Terror did kill for a reason, but many were just duped."
Well, they were literally taken for a ride. They were filled up with vodka and caviar. They were shown model collective farms. There's a Russian word, pokazhuka, which really sums up. They're very good at window dressing.
Hello, all my friends in America. Hello, all you dear boobs who have been saying for a month past that I have gone dotty about Russia. Well, if the latest news from your side is true, you can hardly be saying that now. Russia has the laugh of us. She has us fooled, beaten, shamed, shown up, outpointed. Russia flaunts her budget surplus of 150 million. Her people employed to the last man and woman. Her scientific agriculture doubling and trebling her harvests. Her roaring and multiplying factories. Her efficient rulers. Her atmosphere of such hope and security as has never before been seen in a civilized country on earth.
Walter Duranty of the New York Times supported Stalin's lies to keep a privileged place in Moscow. In his influential articles, he said reports of famine were mostly bunk, but he knew the truth. A British embassy file nails Duranty as a liar. It records that in private, Mr. Duranty considers it possible that 10 million people may have died directly or indirectly from lack of food. Stalin's other big lie was that the Soviet Union was full of internal wreckers. Spontaneous rallies, a new 20th century technique, denouncing Stalin's victims were part of Stalin's remarkable lie that it was the leaders of the Communist Party itself who were agents of the West. The key to the promotion of this lie were the confessions of the accused. Few could believe what we now know to be the truth, that these confessions were obtained from the former heroes of the revolution by medieval methods of torture. Stalin himself joined in some of these torture sessions. Britain's leading experts on Russia, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, declared during the Moscow trials that after 1930, prisoners were no longer beaten or killed. 150 leading American intellectuals declared in a petition that the Moscow trials and the prisoners' confessions were absolutely true. Walter Duranty wrote that Stalin's chief prosecutor Vyshinsky was a truthful man.
Они готовят открыть фронт нашей страны, они готовят открыть границы нашей страны, они готовы открыть широко ворота иностранному завоевателю, но они хотят изобразить это дело так, как будто это черное дело каких-то иных, чужих рук, против которых они, видите ли, вот эти вот иезуиты и фарисеи, эти Иуды Искариоты и Василий Шуйский поднимают теперь свой голос подлинного советского патриотизма. Игра разоблачена.
Victims of purges and trials from 1928 onwards included all of the revolution's heroes. Only one of them, apparently safe in exile, decided to believe in bourgeois truth again: Trotsky.
There are no crime in history more terrible in intention or execution than the Moscow trials of Zinoviev Kamenev and Radik Petakov. What is now my principal task? To reveal the truth, to show and to demonstrate that the true criminals hide under the cloak of the accusers.
I think the prisoners were all in the dock, and I'm not sure it wasn't the moment when they were actually condemned to death. And they had the lights on them. They're being filmed. We suddenly noticed a little window with dark glass in it, smoked glass. And the light went straight on it, and through it we suddenly saw Stalin sitting there watching his former colleagues being condemned to death for all these horrifying crimes. He had rather a sardonic sense of humor, and I think it interested him to see how they were reacting and that sort of thing.
But Stalin's famines and purges were played down and suppressed by Western governments, who needed him to fight Hitler.
Delegates from the borders of Outer Mongolia are honored in Moscow, and a little girl from far-off Central Asia gives a bouquet of flowers to the man of steel who melts to honey.
12 months later, Uncle Joe ordered the arrest and torture of this girl's father. By deliberately implicating an entire society in his crimes, Stalin was able to keep his lies in power long after his death. Only during the Gorbachev era has the truth and some of the bodies been dug up. Although Stalinism killed 24 million people, some still believe that Stalin's ends justified Stalin's means.
The need for able-bodied men in Germany to be in perfect physical condition is emphasized constantly by the government. Germany has always been an admirer of physical prowess, and the German Tourenverein has been noted throughout the world. But never has it been so active as today, under the impetus of Hitler's mandate to build the German nation into the world's strongest and fittest race.
Racial prejudice goes back as far as you can imagine, but the German tradition begins in a big way in the 1890s. Alfred Plutz is usually regarded as the founder of racial hygiene, and he writes his book in 1895 called Racial Hygiene, the Protection of the Fit and the elimination of the unfit. He says we should give incentives to the fit members of the population to have more babies, and we should really try to cut off the reproduction of the unfit. And in fact, when Hitler takes power in 1933, racial hygiene is an orthodoxy, and it's become a kind of international fashion, popular really throughout the Western world.
The Nazis used the power of the state and the cinema to convert racial prejudice into scientific truth. The emphasis on physical fitness was a prelude to the attack on the unfit. It's no accident that Hitler's very first law reserved swimming pools for pure Aryans. The jolly genetic family exercising for health was a favorite theme. The imagery of the holiday camps prepared the way for concentration camps. Women in Berlin's parks literally measured up to see who had the most perfect Aryan shape.
For the Conference of Welfare Leaders in London, Germany sends Frau Scholz-Klink, described as the Nazis' perfect woman. This implies that she has all the virtues of womanhood, which are too many to enumerate here.
Mein Fräulein, wenn heute zwei junge Menschen heiraten wollen, dann müssen sie sich der großen Verantwortung bewusst sein, die sie zu tragen haben. Sie heiraten doch nicht nur, sagen wir, um mit einem geliebten Menschen ständig beisammen zu sein. Schließlich wollen sie doch auch Kinder haben. Also.
First sterilization laws passed really in the Western world were in Indiana in 1907. And this allowed mainly people who were suffering from mental illness or people incarcerated in prisons to be sterilized against their will.
They decided there was but one important action to take, to have your entire family sterilized.
Well, what's that? I don't know what you're talking about.
Well, we investigated your family's history, Alice. And those of the past 3 generations have been feeble-minded, congenital cripples, or habitual drunkards. Instead of improving, each generation is more of a problem. Now, in this state, we have a law which provides for such people to have an operation so there won't be any more children.
I see.
You wouldn't want to marry some fine young man and be ashamed of the children you had.
And you mean they're going to stop me from having children ever?
Exactly.
There were proposals in the United States for castration of criminals. There were efforts to sterilize using X-rays and so forth.
Do you know anything about her family background?
Oh, yes, Your Honor, I do.
There are several other children, aren't there?
Yes.
What is their condition?
One is a cripple. Two others might be classed as feeble-minded.
Isn't the oldest son in jail?
Well, yes, I believe so.
And knowing all that, you still contend that this girl should be allowed to bring more people like that into the world?
She's sound, Your Honor.
Suppose she is normal. The chances are that her children will inherit the family taste. Isn't that possible? I'm sorry, Doctor. 3 generations of unfit are enough.
The most important influence of the American racial policy on the German racial hygiene movement was probably the sterilization laws. And by the time the Nazis take power in 1933, there are more than 20 American states with some form of sterilization law. Racial hygienists began, and Nazi propagandists began using film techniques in the 1930s to whip up a kind of fear and hatred for the mentally ill and physically handicapped, as well as for any other races than the Nordic acceptable race. And so film after film is made going into the mental hospitals, showing people with one or another form of physical or mental deformity or illness. And these are then used to whip up this sentiment.
Diese erbkranken Geschwister einer Familie kosten bis jetzt 154.000 Mark. Wie viele gesunde Menschen hätten dafür siedeln können?
And by the 1920s, you get a synthesis of these two movements, the anti-Semitic Nazi movement, the racial hygiene movement, primarily worried about the breeding of the inferiors. Then when these two combine in the 1920s, you get the view that the Jew is a kind of genetic defective.
Pais und Bart, Kappe und Kaftan kennzeichnen den Ostjuden für jedermann. Legt er sie ab, so erkennen nur schärfer blickende Menschen seine rassische Herkunft. Es ist ein wesentliches Charaktermerkmal des Juden, dass er immer bestrebt ist, seine Abstammung zu verbergen, wenn er sich unter Nichtjuden bewegt.
Jews are said to be have a kind of inherent propensity to commit crime or to do other kinds of immoralities and so forth. And then this becomes a kind of logic that the Nazis can use. They can say we're performing a kind of cleansing of the race by eliminating the Jews. We know now that at this time the trucks would arrive in such numbers, bringing people from one hospital to the death camps, that people knew what was going on. The stench was so strong. It was a convenient excuse after the war to say that we simply didn't know. But I think that the moral problem that really arises is that the people didn't want to know. Those who didn't know, even if they didn't know, I would blame them for not wanting to know.
Dann wird das Ergebnis nicht der Sieg des Judentums sein, sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa.
So the Nazis were able to look to America and say, look, you have sterilization laws, you have laws banning marriage between blacks and whites, you have a segregated American Medical Association, we're simply doing the same thing.
Ich bin nichts gewesen als ein treuer Diener von meinem Souverän. Was kann ich dafür, wenn euer Herzog ein Verräter? Ich will ja alles wieder gut machen. Ich schwöre es euch, ich bin unschuldig. Ich bin nur ein armer Jud. Lasst mir mein Leben. Ich will leben. Das Leben will ich leben.
One of the 20th century's most enduring big lies was the lie about the massacre of Polish officers in the Katyn forest.
Now, the Germans discovered this in March 43, and the Germans investigated the grave and discovered quite a lot of bodies of Polish officers, 4,000, who, with this identical shot in the back of the neck. said the Russians have shot these Polish officers, and the date of death, which they forensically established, they said was March 1940. Now, the Russians, of course, countered by saying, no, the Germans have done this.
The Nazis, acting as truth-tellers, filmed their discovery of Stalin's massacre, produced documents, and interviewed eyewitnesses. When the Soviets re-invaded Poland, they put the Nazi story into reverse. The same eyewitnesses were re-interviewed on film. Now they said Hitler was the killer. Katyn was a Nazi crime.
Now, for a long time, the Russian line was that this was a Nazi war crime. In Nuremberg in 1945, Katyn figured as one of the Nazi war crimes. It was mysteriously dropped. The Russians didn't insist on it because they knew they would lose on it. They maintained that lie until Mazowiecki, the first non-communist Polish prime minister, visited Moscow. And Gorbachev announced finally, yes, Katyn was done by the Russians. But from 1943, we were told in the Soviet media that Katyn had been a German war crime, not a Soviet one. It's only now that they've admitted it.
Hate! 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 Hate!
Szocializmust építő népünk harci seregszemléje volt az idei május 1-je.
A very 20th century form of lie was perfected during the Cold War. People in Eastern Europe who had been deprived of their freedom were forced to participate in spontaneous rallies supporting their jailers. In this way, communist leaders compromised everyone into endorsing, in public, all the big lies of these regimes.
Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin zászlaja alatt.
Hitler created the lie of the genetic happy family, Stalin the lie of the ideological happy family. Both lies required enemies outside and within, and new show trials.
Jménem republiky. Okresní soud trestní uznal po hlavním líčení konaném dne 17., 18. a 19. dubna takto právem. Adolf Dobrovolný, majitel drogerie, Anna Trasčová, mimo pracovní pomoc.
Soud lidu vynesl trest právem nejtěžší. Smrt parazitům, škůdcům a smrtelným nepřátelům lepšího, šťastnějšího světa socialismu.
In the West, a mirror image of communist lies came from fanatical anti-communism.
Main Street, USA, at peace, unaware that a cabal of conspirators plots its enslavement. At Mosinee, Wisconsin, two former communists show how a highly organized minority, using the seizure techniques taught in Moscow, can take over a city. First, the mayor is hustled off to jail, and then the chief of police.
To make a people frightened is a terrible thing to do. To maintain their fears through thick and thin, to exaggerate every danger.
We learned in school that home life does not encourage the growth of the collective character which the party wishes to develop in its young people. It's your fault. You should have spent more time training him to think along party lines. As a member of the Young Pioneers, it will be my duty to report you.
You better listen to me, all of you. I don't want to hear any more talk about state schools and party lines and collective character and deviationism. Now you're really going to find out what the truth is all about.
We tried to tell you, Dad, but you wouldn't listen. There is no more Sunday school.
What's happened? What have they done? Keep your voice down, comrade. Otherwise, I shall have to report you. This place is a lie. Everything about it is false. This was not invented by a Russian. man's name was Bell, Alexander Graham Bell. And he was an American. Get that, comrade.
You could not, in the 50s, get up and speak about anything without first saying, I am no communist but.
We're going to get the answer to that question if we have to stay here for a week. Are you a member of the Communist Party? Or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
Europeans came to America and wondered why we were so paranoid about the Soviet threat. We were paranoid about the Soviet threat because that's all we ever heard was the Soviet threat.
Communist power, moving in a red tide across the world. Communist power, reducing man to a slave of the state. Communist power, sweeping everything before it, destroying the old, enthroning the new creed of atheistic materialism.
Harry Truman introduced a loyalty program. That is, he introduced the concept that there are two kinds of Americans, loyal Americans and disloyal Americans.
I'm not going to ask you to take my word for whether there are communists in government and in the State Department. I have in my hand a document which I've never used before. It's a brief prepared by 7 of the top lawyers from the Attorney General's office, prepared and signed by them. Not 10 years ago, not 5 years ago, not 1 year ago, 5 weeks ago.
Senator Joe McCarthy, a second-rate thug, utterly ignored by his fellow senators, who discovered, almost by accident, that if he would say that the State Department, in fact, are the traitors to the United States, that communism is, in fact, running America, running the imperial foreign policy.
Plans have been discussed by leading members of the party and agents of the Soviet secret police to obtain blank American passports from the United States State Department from communists employed in the State Department.
He could gather a crowd, a real crowd, one of the first real mad mobs in America, I think, was the followers of Senator Joe McCarthy, because he said that the State Department were communist traitors.
The Senate committee launches a public investigation of McCarthy's charges. The most sensational case is that of Owen Lattimore, a prominent professor of history who was active in political circles. Lattimore, says McCarthy, is the top Russian spy, the key man in a Russian espionage ring. I am willing, says the senator, to stand or fall on the Lattimore case.
I am not and never have been a member of the Communist Party.
I hope the senator will lay his machine gun down. He is too reckless, careless, and irresponsible to have a license to use it.
The Army charges persecution at the hands of Senator McCarthy. One of McCarthy's assistants, G. David Shine, has been drafted, and McCarthy allegedly has tried to get him preferential treatment in the service. When we refused, says the Army, McCarthy unleashed a personal vendetta against us. The Army's attorney is Joseph Welsh, a soft-spoken Bostonian who is a dramatic contrast to McCarthy. But he, too, is a shrewd showman. Welsh tries for most of the hearing to hide his antagonism for McCarthy. But one day, the senator accuses Welsh of having an assistant who belonged to an organization reportedly sympathetic to communism. This is perhaps the most dramatic duel in the entire hearing.
Until this moment, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness. If it were in my power to forgive you for your reckless cruelty, I would do so. I like to think I'm a gentleman. But your forgiveness will have to come from someone other than me.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Wells talks about this being cruel and reckless.
Senator, may we not drop this? Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir?
Mr. Welch here has been filibustering this hearing.
Mr. McCarthy, I will not discuss it further. You, Mr. Chairman, may, if you will, Call the next witness.
These people who didn't know what to say just rallied around this lunatic who said that the people you hate are traitors. Period. They've been calling you traitor, you call them a traitor. The hell with it. Get your own back. And that was the McCarthy era. Active dissenters in the country, they were crushed. They were literally crushed.
Headed by their red boss, Eugene Dennis, who was his own lawyer, the convicted conspirators, handcuffed in pairs, enter the marshal's van for transportation to prison. A triumph of justice, despite the defense attempts to achieve a travesty. Notice that America is fed up with citizens whose loyalties are pledged to foreign governments.
McCarthy's anti-communism helped to create the big lie about Vietnam.
This, the story of a U.S. Marine who felt the full heat of the Cold War.
Don, I think I got nicked. I'm losing power.
In the traditional motion picture story, the villains are usually defeated. The ending is a happy one. I can make no such promise for the picture you're about to watch.
Will you be kind enough to tell us what accounts for your presence in my country?
The United States is here at the request of the Vietnamese government.
The biggest lie that was told was the entire framework of discussion, that the United States was defending South Vietnam against its own people, and that it was expanding the war in order to defend South Vietnam. That is a colossal falsehood.
To sell a war to the American people required a world polarized between good democracies and bad dictatorships. So South Vietnam's dictator, Dinh Diem, had to be presented as a kind of Democrat.
He has doubled the number of secondary schools, quadrupled the number of children in the elementary schools, cut the illiteracy rate by half. All this, for example, gives me a sense of progress and a feeling of confidence that he will continue to move his country toward a democratic structure.
The American people, like other people, look at the information available to them and try to make a judgment. When the information presented to them is profound lies and there is no contrary voice expressed, it's not surprising that people accept the lies as true.
In those days, 2nd Air Division aircraft flew strike missions only when Vietnamese Air Force capabilities were taxed to the limit. The rules under which our aircraft operated were equally restrictive. All aircraft carried the VNAF insignia, and a Vietnamese Air Force observer was on board during all missions. And no target was hit without a specific request and subsequent approval from Vietnamese authorities.
Precision bombing was a crucial lie in the American military's big lie that this was a war conducted with great sensitivity towards the peasants of South Vietnam.
There's not much doubt that the government concealed quite a bit and distorted quite a bit in the course of the Vietnam War, but I think that the disguises were rather thin, and that if the media had not simply followed a patriotic agenda, it could have very quickly been exposed.
The plan to protect those who dwell in thousands of rural villages and towns resulted in the fortifying of approximately 5,000 communities in the first year.
Take the Strategic Hamlet program of the early 1960s. The presentation of that was, well, we're defending the population from terrorists, and therefore we have to put them in this safe place. The fact of the matter is that they were rounding up the population and putting them into concentration camps.
One tactic the enemy has used to great advantage is the ambush. From hiding places in the dense forests, he has been able to spring traps on Allied troops and convoys. This kind of attack is being made increasingly difficult by spraying a non-toxic weed killer on the jungle growth bordering Special Forces camps, important road routes, and other likely ambush areas.
Only after the war did the effects of non-toxic Agent Orange become known. Television was later accused of showing too much horror to the American people, but in fact American television only put harsh truths on screen when they could no longer be suppressed. It was left to maverick journalists and Hollywood stars to be often reviled truth-tellers.
I went there to see with my own eyes if it was true that civilian targets were being bombed. I went there to see with my own eyes if it's true that the morale is, as it's reported, very low, and I found that it was total propaganda on the part of the Nixon administration. And when I saw this, I said, I think that if I can tell the pilots what is happening, if I can describe to them the effects of their bombing, that I don't believe that they will continue. I don't think they know. I don't think they know.
On April the 26th, 1965, the United States Secretary of Defense attempted to assure an increasingly disturbed American public that civilians were not being bombed. Each target, he said, was chosen only after a careful review of reconnaissance photographs to ensure that it was isolated and apart from urban populations. I found the reality different.
Vietnam did not show that true images could defeat big lies.
It is commonly argued that the attention given to the war by the media and the mode of presentation of it finally turned the public, turned the public against the war. There are a number of studies of this, and they all show the opposite.
It was only defeat in war which defeated lies about Vietnam.
If after all of this time and all of this sacrifice and all of this support, there is still no end in sight, then I say the time has come for the American people to turn to new leadership, not tied to the policies and mistakes of the past. I pledge to you, we shall have an honorable end to the war in Vietnam.
Nixon had run as a peacemaker and a statesman, not the scrappy anti-communist of earlier years. He had promised to bring us together, and there was talk of a secret plan to end the war. But was there a secret plan?
No, that was one of those figments of the imagination that always comes up in the campaign.
Chairman Mao, like Hitler, believed the masses would swallow big lies if they were massive, spectacular, and simplified the world.
五四运动举起了反帝反封建的旗帜，传播了共产主义思想。1921年，伟大的中国共产党诞生了。毛泽东同志把马克思列宁主义同中国的革命实践相结合，真理的光辉照亮了中国革命的道路。
像什么？莲姐，你说，为什么长期书记和连长都比我们懂得多，看得远呢？因为他们是共产党员呢。是啊。
至于我从小在中，
I grew up in China and received a Communist Party's education. But in the past, I never believed that it was all lies. I thought it was correct. The party was really great, leading the people to turn over and make revolution, beating the landlords and redistributing the land. At that time, I thought I was extremely lucky to be a child in New China. We believed there were still 2/3 of the people in the world waiting to be liberated. So their lies were very clever.
It was the Chinese Communist Party's monopoly over information and the high levels of fantasy which permeated Mao and his circle, which led directly to the Great Famine of 1958.
I think the real origins have to be looked at in the political system in some ways. One part of the political system, the Chinese government was very committed to expanding the living conditions of the masses. But at the same time, it was, of course, a very undemocratic regime. The total amount of information that the Chinese central government had was also very limited. And they thought, at one stage, they thought that they had 100 million tons more grain than they actually had. I would have thought that about 23 to 30 million extra deaths occurred as a result of the Chinese famine, spread over the period from the end of 58 to the beginning of 62, but primarily 59, 60, 61 were the years. I think what was being hidden was not being hidden only from the rest of the world, but also from the Chinese population about the rest of China.
With no free press to challenge Mao's total censorship, there was no early warning of the famine that killed so many. The famine is still not officially recognized in China. But when the communist fictions were challenged in 1989, all the power of the modern state was deployed to crush the truth-tellers. One of the students' most vociferous demands was for an end to big lies.
The assault on Tiananmen Square is now underway. Troops have entered the square from both the east and the west, although they have halted now that they have reached the sides of the square. There has been gunfire, there are people dead, there are people wounded in various places around Beijing. From our vantage point, we have been seeing gunfire, 2 Tracer 246, Tracer bolts 8, 10, 12, red flares going, firing through the air. An armored personnel carrier is now driving, armored personnel carrier being chased by a huge mob, the tear gas clouds billowing through the air.
Armored personnel carriers were by now pressing slowly across the square. I then noticed that there were some other people about 20 meters away from this tent. I rushed over when one of the APCs was only about a meter from the tent. I heard some girl students inside crying. If they want us to leave, they'll have to carry us out. But they never thought, neither did I, that this APC would not stop. The APC just rolled on, and there was a terrible scream from inside.
The PLA troops marched into Tiananmen Square to fulfill their task of imposing martial law to protect the order in the capital. And no casualty resulted from the clearing of Tiananmen Square. Not one people died on Tiananmen Square.
In the hospitals which I have visited, there are no longer wounded people. I don't know where they are. I don't know what happened to them. But the fact is that they are no longer in the hospitals.
This film gives you a brief introduction to what really happened during the recent student strike, turmoil and rebellion taking place mainly in Beijing. The Voice of America fabricated the rumor that the martial law enforcement troops caused Tiananmen bloodbath and left thousands of, perhaps tens of thousands of people lying in blood.
This official video was quickly withdrawn from the West, but inside China the government continues its building of a new big lie, which may or may not outlive its political creators.
With the development of science and society, Chinese people were able to receive news from abroad. This made them realize they were living a great lie.
Next Monday at 9, American network television is examined in the final program of the trilogy Truth About Lies.